everybody, and welcome to Data Decision Making, Understanding Behavior Through Data. I'm Claudia Hammond. I've seen lots of you already today. This is set to be a really interesting session, I think, because we're all very aware now that our data is being collected and it's being used to create algorithms which can make predictions which might help us. And I doubt I'm the only person here who's become accustomed to going to every website and ticking all the GDPR boxes as fast as possible to try to get through to what I actually want to read. And of course, the whole thing with data does bring up all sorts of ethical issues, and that may come up later, but there has been a separate session on that. So what we're going to be concentrating on is more about using data for good. And the sorts of interesting ways that it can be used to understand the world and as information, but also how you can take that information to improve the world. So we have three really great speakers who are each going to speak in turn. Our Slido number is there. It's D265 again. So do be putting in your questions as we go, and then after they've all spoken, we will sit up here and have a discussion and take a lot of your questions. We will be covering everything from learning from the reviews that people leave online to the way the environment around us affects our well-being, and using data even to work out which schools need inspecting next. And we have with us three speakers. We have Michael Luca from Harvard Business School, Chanuki Illushka Seresinhe from the University of Warwick, and James Lawrence from BIT. And I will tell you more about each of them as they speak. But as I say, do be putting your questions into Slido as you go. So first of all, we're going to hear from Professor Mike Luca from Harvard Business School. He teaches a course on the rise of experiments in organizations and the role that they can play in the decisions a business makes, and whether governments and companies can develop interventions and what sorts of interventions those would be using the wealth of data that's available to them now. Please welcome Mike Luca. Thank you.
All right, so thank you everybody for coming here. I'm super excited to be at BX. Today I'm going to be presenting what's essentially a case study of one of the projects we worked on in this initiative, where we've been thinking about how to use online platforms and data from online platforms for the social good. The paper I'll be focusing on, and we can kind of expand beyond this in the discussion afterwards, is a paper I wrote with my colleague Daisy Dye at Purdue University called Digitizing Disclosure, the Case of Restaurant Hygiene Scores. Just to give a little bit of context around how we started this project started way back in 1997 before I was doing research, in case you weren't sure. So in Los Angeles, and essentially there are a bunch of health inspectors that were sitting around thinking about what to do with the health inspection results that they had. So for a long time they had been inspecting restaurants there just like they do in most cities around the world. They essentially kind of look for, is there one rat? Are there a bunch of rats? Are there no rats? And if there are a bunch of rats, you kind of close the restaurant down until they could kind of get rid of the problem. If there are no rats, then they're probably fine. And they have a checklist of about 30 things, not just rats. But if there's like a single rat or kind of a relatively minor violation, something that they don't want to close the restaurant down for, but don't necessarily want to pay no attention to, there's a question about what you want to do with it. So kind of one thing that they do is help to remedy the situation, give information back to the inspectors. But a second thing that they started thinking about doing is increasing transparency to give this information back to restaurant goers to help them use that information if they choose to do so to decide which restaurant to go to. So what they did is they created this initiative where they started posting inspection results on doors or windows visibly on restaurants. So kind of an A if you had a top score, a B, a C, or kind of a failing grade essentially. And what they found is that this turned out to shape demand quite a bit. So they found that a restaurant with a grade of A got about 5% more sales than restaurants with a grade of B or C. And also what they found is that more restaurants started getting A afterwards. So thinking about this, people started thinking about this as like a successful example of disclosure, not necessarily just kind of in the context of health inspections, but more broadly thinking about how information might help to shape decisions. We started thinking about this project after 2010 when we saw New York City started posting it. And we started thinking about some of the challenges for even a relatively simple intervention to get information back to customers. One thing we noted is that in 1997, there was no Yelp, there was no TripAdvisor, there was no Facebook, so there really weren't other places to get this information back to customers. So the part that got us interested is basically that you have a bunch of new platforms, and we started thinking about how you might want to get this information back to customers, either in addition to or instead of posting it on doors or windows for people to react to, and also how data from these platforms might help you to get a better understanding of what's going on in this disclosure initiative. So what we did is we started partnering with Yelp and city governments, thinking about can you take data that cities have and kind of get it back to customers and help them to design a disclosure initiative to help get the information back in a behaviorally informed way that might help to shape customer decisions. So what we did is we posted health code violations onto Yelp, and we evaluated and redesigned the disclosure initiative that we had for kind of this first round. We did a second round incorporating some of the results that we had seen. So I'll just give kind of a quick overview of why we thought restaurant inspections were an interesting area to go into. I think this kind of reflects some features that we see in a lot of disclosure areas that people have been thinking about, which is that the data and technology have changed over time. So we're kind of seeing more stuff become available. We have to think about whether and how to get this information back to users or customers or kind of whoever the relevant decision makers are. But policy basically hadn't been incorporating some of the changes that we have been seeing in the broader landscape. This also is an interesting area for us because it's a market with relatively little information. So when you think about restaurants, take London, for example, there are thousands of restaurants at any given time, many more than you could possibly sample. So it's kind of an area where disclosure, especially if you give simple information back to people, could be a very useful thing to do. And also, because this was an early success story of disclosure, at least on kind of like the shaping demand side, we started thinking this is an area where we know that customers at least potentially care about this. So if we see no result, there will be kind of a problem with the way that the information is being disclosed rather than just the fact that people don't care about this information at all. So we thought that this was a good area to step in and start thinking about how can you better use data and online platforms to think about the design of disclosure. So what are the conditions that cause posting to work? What are the behavioral factors underlying customer response? And can you kind of leverage online platforms to get information to people at an earlier point when they're doing searches for restaurants? So why review websites? We became interested in this. We were thinking about Yelp, but you could think about Angie's List, Dion Ping, TripAdvisor, and there are countless others. Like basically for any product or service, we could all think about kind of review sites that are out there helping to provide information about them. This is all part of the crowdsourcing movement. This was interesting for me personally because we had been thinking kind of even before this about what the impact of these reviews are on sales. So there's growing literature showing that people are paying attention to this and this is starting to shape markets. So just to give a sense of what a Yelp search might look like, so if you were to look for Indian restaurants in London, like I frequently do, you go on and you can kind of type this in and you could choose whether you want the highest rated, most reviewed, you could sort by price, you could look for things that have delivery or takeout, and you'll get a list that looks something like this and a map view of it. So then what we had done is we layered on in San Francisco. In San Francisco, they have a numerical system for the hygiene scores there. So I should kind of point out that one challenge like to these types of disclosure initiatives is that every city has a different way that they disclose information. Some do a star system, some do a letter grade. In San Francisco, they were doing a numerical score. So you could see like our first round of disclosure was not terribly salient, but basically you would look at this Alexander Steakhouse, you would scroll down, and health score is the score that they had in their most recent hygiene violation. Then you could dig down on that and you could learn what the violations were, and you could see kind of what their historical scores have been in prior visits as well. So this was the first round, and basically what we found is that if you run like a linear regression, it didn't seem like there was that much action going on, but there was some suggestive evidence that if you look at kind of like the two timings of when we put more businesses on, we started looking at consumer leads, so basically purchase intentions from Yelp as the outcome variable that we were tracking, which was things like, was a phone call made to the restaurant? Did somebody search for directions afterwards? Did they click on the map button to figure out like where the business is? They try to make a reservation. And we use that to have this composite measure of leads. And if you break things into the city's preferred metric for businesses that are the lowest grade versus other businesses, it seems that there is some drop in demand for the lowest rated businesses relative to the other businesses in the city. This is robust to looking at kind of a parallel city as well to kind of see that this trend is something that's happening in San Francisco, but not in the others, not in other cities that we looked at that didn't have this posting initiative. So then, kind of thinking about this, it seemed like kind of a mixed story, like kind of if you just run this linear regression, it doesn't seem like all of the scores seem to matter to people. There was some evidence of nonlinear effects, all concentrated out at the bottom. So what we started thinking about is kind of one advantage of having more data, and in particular more rapid data, which is a common feature of getting data from online sources relative to some of the traditional sources we're used to thinking about, is that you could redesign this relatively easy, comparatively at least to thinking about if London were to redesign the posting on doors initiative, which would take time to track other data and take time to implement. So what we ended up doing is changing the design of this. And we were thinking about, does the design of the way that information is being presented to people matter? And in particular, can we make this more salient for customers who are deciding whether or not to visit a business? So we created this alert, and the alert essentially came onto a business's page if they were in the bottom 5% of all restaurants in terms of scores, and if they were rated as poor by the city, so that's a score less than 70. And we made this kind of additional restriction, which is that it stays on until the reinspection or 6 months, whichever sooner. And the reason we did that is because the restaurants were supposed to be getting inspected, but some re-inspected, but sometimes there was an extra delay, and we didn't want there to be kind of like an extra penalty based on delays from like the inspection process. To give you a sense of what the alert looked like, here's what it said. Did you know that local officials inspect food service facilities to improve food safety? Following a recent inspection, this facility received a food safety rating that's in the bottom 5% and is categorized by inspectors as poor, and then kind of explains what else is going on. And you actually have to click this "Got it, thanks" button before you actually get to the page. So when you think about this, it's a lot more salient than the first round, but it's actually happening only for a small subset of the businesses that are there. So trying to draw attention in the situation where somebody, either kind of the policy decision about like what's poor, or a Yelp decision about like what are the situations in which they think this information is most useful for customers, but only for a subset of businesses, this more salient alert is going to get flagged. So this is actually a text that I got from a friend who was a chief economist at another tech company who was walking to Hong Kong Lounge too, and just texted me and said, "Yeah, you saved me," when he got this alert on his walk and went somewhere else. I can only guess he went to Hong Kong Lounge 103. But once I got that message from him, it kind of made me realize that this does suggest that kind of it's not just having the scores on there, but thinking carefully about how to design them and how to incorporate behavioral economics into the design of disclosure is an important feature for businesses and policymakers to be thinking about. So looking at this, actually, again, we see that there's a drop in business for the ones that got the alert relative to other businesses. But to be honest, like if anything, the effect was smaller than what we had been expecting going into it. So you get this kind of blaring sign that comes out at you. It's very salient. You have to click to get out of it. And it's not as if like all the businesses lost all their business afterwards. So basically, what we found is an additional 9% drop in leads, again, kind of defined by this composite index of things like calls and direction requests. Yeah. But thinking about this, like the conclusions that we drew from it were essentially that the design of disclosure is important. So if you read back through the disclosure literature for a long time, a lot of it had been saying, does disclosure work? Yes, it works. No, it works. No, it doesn't work. And the evidence was mixed. And what we started thinking about is a lot of this really does come down to a design decision on the part of whoever it is that's going to be bringing the information back to people. Yeah, how salient is it? Like, are you really bringing kind of customer attention into it? And kind of the second insight that we took from this is really that that it's data from a platform like Yelp was very useful in helping to rapidly iterate, both in terms of changing the design, but also in evaluating the data. So kind of trying to think about this in a much quicker scale than we would have been if we had to wait for other metrics of demand. And so basically, kind of in this paper, it was the digital data that allowed for the testing and iteration. Now, kind of when we could get into some discussion, I think that then as a policymaker, or a researcher, or a manager, then it's important to think about what some of the trade-offs are. Like, so both what are the strengths of these types of data, but what are the limitations of using this? It's kind of, in our case, we're looking at leads. What I would have loved to have seen is more things on things like kind of final sales for businesses. And I think that's kind of the world we're entering into when we start to think about these new data sources. You have some metrics. The metrics might be more rapid, they might be more granular, and all of that is great. But they also may be further away from the thing that you care about, sort of in the way that when Google looks at clicks as an outcome, that's further away from what they care about than kind of some of the outcomes that they care about more deeply, such as like kind of whether people are satisfied with the results of their search. So just to wrap this up, basically, for us, this was an exciting project, and this is true of some of the other projects that we've been doing in this area as well, is basically we've been living in this world of growing data and thinking about what to do with it. One thing we started thinking about is what are the different types of data sources that are now coming about. And one bucket is kind of digital exhaust, so data from online platforms that really kind of is getting repurposed as data. So Yelp data is really intended to help people make decisions about which business to go to, but also gives you new insight into economic activity. And we've got open and digitized government records. So in this case, digitization of health inspections was an important part of the project. So in fact, in the first stage of the matching, there were kind of a set of 3 or 4 different stakeholders, so I could talk a little bit more about afterwards, that were all involved in matching the health records back to Yelp data, just to kind of make it so that we could get this into a standardized format that then you could put up online for people to look at. A third bucket is corporate data sets, so think about gym-going behavior or data that insurance or bank companies might have access to. And thinking about all of these, this could transform policy, both by kind of giving better reach to policymakers and researchers to get to customers at more timely moments, to give them information that's useful for them, but also gives you kind of better data to look at or more data to look at to get a sense of what the impact of different policies are. So thinking about all this, we picked this area partly because we thought this is a relatively simple example of what disclosure might look like. Kind of you can imagine relative to, say, ranking schools or something where there's like many dimensions that you're thinking about. We thought that there's kind of at least a narrower set of dimensions, but it turns out even there, even with relatively simple objectives, there are a lot of questions, some behavioral, some more kind of neoclassical. There are things that kind of, even in the simplest of settings, that it's kind of a ripe time for thinking about both design interventions and thinking about how can we be more careful with the data that we're getting access to and in the design of the information that we're giving back to people. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mike. And do be putting questions into Slido now before you forget them because of listening to the next speaker. And do put who the questions are for, unless it's for all and any of them. But if it's questions for Mike, do put Mike at the front of them. That would be great. That was absolutely fascinating. I'd love to know what the restaurants make of that. Next up, we have Dr. Chanuki Illushka Seresinhe, who's a doctoral researcher at Warwick Business School and at the Alan Turing Institute. She previously ran a digital design consultancy, and she'll be telling us what big online data sets can tell us about beauty in the environment and our well-being. Thank you.
So for centuries, humans have expressed their appreciation for beauty through philosophy, literature, and art. Governments around the world also value beauty as evidence from the protection of outstanding areas of natural beauty. Architects and designers often place emphasis on the aesthetics of what they create, not just the utilitarian function. And as individuals, we often seek out beautiful places when we want to lift our spirits or be more relaxed. But until now, quantitative evidence supporting this idea that beautiful places are beneficial to human beings have been lacking because we don't have data on the beauty of the environment. So normally when we look at the connection between the environment and our well-being, for example, we had to kind of rely on data that was a bit easier to capture. So for example, percentage of green space in an area, distance to parks, what type of land cover, is it an ocean, mountain, and measures of biodiversity. But you can imagine that measuring beauty, especially on a large scale, like an entire country, would be quite difficult because we tended to collect data in the past through surveys. And if you wanted to do it for an entire country, it would be very expensive and time-consuming. But luckily, these days, we spend a lot of time on the internet, and now the internet's a fantastic source of collecting data. So I was really excited to come across this website called Scenic or Not, and it's a simple game people play. They just rate these images between 1 and 10, and it's surprisingly addictive. And by the time I came across this data, there was about 217,000 images that have been rated about 1.5 million times. And in the background, there's one image that represents every square kilometer of England. So this is kind of how it all maps out. And for those that like to go hiking in England, you can see like the spots come out, such as the Lake District, the Peak District, but also it's like Somerset and Devon, where people also like to go on holidays, also come out in this, from this data. So you must be asking, well, what makes a place beautiful? And if we think in our minds of a beautiful place, we tend to think of natural places. But if beautiful places are simply natural places, then this data really isn't going to tell us anything new, because we know that natural places are linked with better well-being. So I wanted to know whether there was a collective understanding of beauty that went beyond this idea that beauty and natural are synonymous. And so you can say, of course, that individual ideas of beauty, are subjective, but there's some theories that argue that there might be a collective understanding of beauty based on our evolutionary preferences. So, for example, maybe we prefer certain features in our environment that have helped us survive. So one of these theories is Kellett and Wilson's biphilia hypothesis, which explains why we have a tendency to find more attractive certain natural features, such as fruit-bearing or climbable trees. Another interesting theory is J. Appleton's prospect and refuge theory, and that kind of explains, when you look out into the horizon, you also find that to be beautiful, and it's saying that might be driven by the fact that looking out on the scene makes us feel safer because we can kind of view opportunities and also potential dangers. But these are just theories. So how do we actually test these theories? So luckily, I've got these 217,000 images, and I can try to use this data. But of course, if I try to manually break down these images into the different kinds of features that are in each image, that will take way too much time. And this is where, artificial intelligence comes to the rescue, because they've made some fantastic progress with computer vision tasks, such as object recognition and facial recognition. So I used one of these artificial intelligence algorithms. So it's at MIT Places. And it's really good at actually extracting hundreds of different categories from images. So for example, I can say, is it mainly a man-made space, or is it a natural space? Is it an enclosed space or an open space? And also I can extract place categories. For example, as you see in the images, is it a tower, skyscraper, office building, or is it a coast or an ocean? So I ran my images through this neural network, extracted all these features, and did a statistical analysis, and here's what I found. So, unsurprisingly, of course, the natural features are going to come out being linked with beauty. For example, coastal scenes, valleys and mountains, forests and trees. But surprisingly, we also see features that are built up coming out as well. So characterful buildings, such as cottages and lighthouses, and also bridge-like structures, such as viaduct and aqueduct. Unsurprisingly, when we look at what's unscenic, of course, we get stuff like industrial highway, not a big surprise. But I thought what's interesting is that people also were rating down images that didn't have a horizon. So if you couldn't look out into the view, people were rating that down. And that does echo a little bit with J. Appleton's theory. And surprisingly, though, we just don't seem to like areas of flat grass. So, and I think that's really interesting for the green space debate, because we don't talk enough about the quality of green space sometimes. So this is great. So from Scenic or Not, I've got an image per square kilometer, and it does look like really rich data. But the problem is an image per square kilometer in a city is not good enough, because there's a large variety of scenes within a kilometer. So I wanted to know if I can actually generate ratings of beauty. So I actually went back to these artificial intelligence networks, and I actually trained a network to buy all the scenic data to learn how to now rate new images that it would see as being beautiful or not. So the training data is a scenic or not data, and now I can predict the beauty of a place. And this is kind of how it maps out around London. And of course, we do see things we expect. For example, of course, like Regent's Park and Hyde Park have got the blue dots. The blue dots are the scenic dots, the red dots are the not so scenic dots. It's not so clear because of the resolution, but around the Tower of London and St. Paul's, you have also these blue dots because they're beautiful built-up areas. It's not just natural scenes coming out. It's also beautiful built-up areas as well. So I have this great data, and so in a recently published study, I wanted to look at the connection between beautiful places and our happiness. And I was really excited to work with this data from Georgia Markarian at LSE, this project called Mappiness. And what happens is, as you go around your everyday life, you're basically pinged 2 times a day to report how happy you are. And this is great because you get to measure the happiness in real time, and so that helps to minimize biases that might be due to recall, for example. I can also control for a lot of different variables because this data, again, is quite rich. So people don't just report how happy they are. They also tell you, are they home or at work, what activities they're doing. And of course, because it's mobile phone data, we have their GPS location, and we can use that to link to even more data, such as weather, the income of the area, whether you're in actually a natural or built-up environment. Because what I really want to know is if somebody is actually happy because they're in a beautiful area and not just because it's sunny and they're in a natural space. And I'm happy to report that basically individuals do report that they're significantly happier when visiting environments that are more scenic. So I wanted to also know whether this connection held for other aspects of well-being, because this has policy implications. So, for example, if we only find a connection with momentary well-being, such as we can measure by happiness, then say we could justify ways to kind of improve our everyday happiness. For example, when we visit a park, maybe we want to make that park more beautiful, or we want to make a street that's well-trafficked more beautiful. But if we find a connection between other aspects of well-being that might be more long-lasting, for example, life satisfaction, then we can justify even more substantial investments. For example, investments into beautifying social housing projects or urban infrastructure. So I looked at another source of data. It's called Understanding Society. So it's basically an annual survey of around 40,000 individuals, and they survey people on all kinds of themes, such as your family life, employment, education, finances, health, and well-being. And I specifically looked at the question about mental distress using the general health questionnaire, and also life satisfaction. So how satisfied are you with your life overall? Unfortunately, I didn't find a connection with either less mental distress or life satisfaction. And I found this a bit confusing because in another study I did a long time ago, I actually found a connection between self-reported health and beauty. So it's not that it was only a momentary happiness, it just seemed to be a long effect. But, why isn't it showing up? So anyway, in this study, we basically looked at census data from 2011, where people report their health. They say whether their health is very good, or very bad. And again, we looked at the connection between health and scenicness, and we still controlled for a lot of variables, for example, income deprivation and pollution. And we did find, across all of England, people do report better health when they're living in areas of greater beauty. But I was a bit worried because in this study I only had 1 year of data. So I was kind of concerned that maybe this is not going to be replicated in this new data set. So I wanted to test it. So I did use the Understanding Society data again. It has exactly the same question. How do you feel about your health? Very good, good, bad, very bad. And luckily, there is still that connection. So I was like, phew. So there is that connection between self-reported health and beautiful places. So why this discrepancy? So, it could possibly be adaptation. When you move to a neighborhood, maybe initially you think it's beautiful, so that's like the happiness boost, but eventually you just kind of forget about it. I used to live in California, hence the Californian accent. Completely took the beach for granted. Of course, I miss it all the time now. And so sometimes the focus also can change based on the question. So for example, if you're asking somebody, how satisfied are you with your life? You're probably thinking about perhaps income rather than how beautiful your neighborhood is. So the questions we ask people to measure the well-being changes. The answer could be different based on what people are imagining in their mind at the time. But why are we still seeing this connection with reported health? So it could be that when people are living in these more beautiful areas, just engaging in more healthy activities. So maybe you're more likely to go for a walk or run in the park because your neighborhood is more beautiful. And perhaps that's a reason. So I still need to explore exactly why there's that discrepancy. But what I want to for you to take away is that the different sources of data give you a different understanding of the question that you want to answer. And I think it's important when you're trying to answer a question with data to actually look at these different perspectives. But basically what I'm really excited about is that these new sources of data and these new approaches of data analysis, such as artificial intelligence, are helping us gain insights that were previously unfeasible. And we can inform decisions now that can impact millions of people's lives. So for example, how might we design a future city to be more beautiful and enjoyable to live in? That's it. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And you definitely get the prize for the prettiest slides we've had so far. There are lots of lovely things to look at there. Now, our final speaker is James Lawrence, who's head of quantitative research within the Behavioural Insight team's research and evaluation team. And he's managed projects in policing and road safety and targeting government inspections, and is going to speak to us about some of his work now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claudia. I'm going to sort of give quite a wide-ranging talk in this next 15 minutes. Now, all of the examples I'm going to show you are things which are technically possible and actually often technically not very challenging, but actually haven't been used on a widespread scale for a number of reasons that I'll also go into. So I'm going to talk about online reviews. I'm not going to just rehash Mike's talk. I'm going to focus particularly on public sector outcomes. I'm also going to talk about a couple of examples of using personal data and how that can signal when individuals are in need of help. And I'll talk about those aforementioned issues as to why these things aren't more widespread already. Now, as Mike's already told you, reviews are very much available to the public. I mean, Yelp, back in the 90s and 80s, Yelp was preceded by the Yellow Pages, which was a big business directory. And back then, if you wanted to sort of look up a review for something, maybe you were thinking about buying your next holiday paperback novel or deciding where to go and eat, you'd have to look in the newspaper, which, it's some level of accessibility, but it only covered certain industries and it was by no means prevalent everywhere. But now, if you want to go and watch a film, you can just log on to IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes. If you want to know what other people think of your restaurant, you can just look at various different review sites, or you can look on Facebook for reviews of virtually anything. And that also goes for public sector services. So, for example, if you've moved to a new area and you're thinking about which GP practice do I want to register with, then you can look on the NHS website and you can see various public reviews and some sort of salient information. So, for example, whether most of their patients have online appointment booking and things like that. And actually, reviews are incredibly helpful for regulators. Now, Mike's already shown you an example where a regulator can kind of disseminate their information and their reviews to customers using an online review platform. I'm going to view this sort of in the reverse way, where we can use data from online platforms as a regulator to help us regulate. So a couple of years ago, we did a big data analysis and machine learning project to understand whether we could predict the results of CQC inspections. So the CQC is the Care Quality Commission. It's their job to inspect GP practices in the UK. And we found that actually you can predict the results of CQC inspections. So if you use online review data from the NHS website and you combine that with prescriptions data, which in the UK is freely available and is in some other countries as well, so we know that a GP practice has prescribed however many units of a particular drug in a particular month, and you also combine that with some clinical indicators, and these are typically along the lines of if we'd have expected a GP practice to detect, say, 500 cases of COPD in a given month, but they only detected 250, then those discrepancies form what we call clinical indicators, and they're important sources of information as a regulator. So by combining those 3 different sources of information, we can actually identify 95% of GP practices that were rated inadequate at their next CQC inspection. And that's if we sort of get to choose 20% that we can go and look at. So they're very, very powerful sources of data. And that naturally led us to wonder, could we do the same thing in other areas of the public sector? And the answer is that we can. So we did a similar investigation into Ofsted inspections of schools. So again, on similar lines, using parent surveys, which Ofsted administers as part of their inspection regime, called Parent View, and by mixing that with admin data and demographics from schools, and also academic attainment and progress and value-added scores, we were able to identify 87% of currently good schools that will be rated inadequate or requires improvement at their next Ofsted inspection. Now, at the time, we didn't focus on outstanding schools because at the time the legislation was that Ofsted had to leave them alone for a period of some years, and that's actually been a very recent policy change in that Ofsted now is able to inspect outstanding schools more quickly than before, because there may in some instances be evidence of a change in standard. So we've seen that using publicly available data, and particularly review data, can give regulators a powerful indication of where there may be issues and where they should perhaps target their inspections. But as I said at the start, these are all things which are technically possible, but there are a number of reasons why they're not yet widespread. So in the public sector, inspectors have an important role to play because choice can be limited in some cases. Imagine if you've just moved to a new area and you're choosing a school, you probably won't have very many new schools to choose from, particularly secondary schools, and particularly if you can't afford any sort of private options that may be out there. Because of that, market forces may not operate properly. The free market theory is that if one service is not performing very well, then consumers will avoid it. It will then lose business and shrink and eventually remove itself from the market, and something else will spring up in its place. But in the absence of an effective regulator, that may not necessarily happen because there may be that lack of choice. Now, set against that, providers have the right to know why they're being inspected, but this could lead to gaming the targeting algorithm. So it wasn't a piece of data we used in our algorithm, but let's say, for example, that a school is predicted to do well in its Ofsted inspection if it buys lots of red pens. Now, there might be a reasonable explanation. It means that it's marking its homework very carefully and that it's engaging with its students very well. But imagine you're a school and you want to avoid being inspected, not because you've got anything to hide necessarily, but because it's quite disruptive. Then all you have to do is, go down to the stationers and buy a few extra boxes of red pens and then just give them to the kids and let them colour in something. And so the effectiveness of that machine learning technique is then greatly diminished because everyone's gaming the system. And so in practice, you have to sort of restrict the sets of data that you use to those where if an organisation is able to increase that particular score, it's because they're doing something right. So if you think back to the clinical indicators, if they look more normal, then that's probably just a good sign. It means that the GP practice is detecting the number of cases that it should be. But potentially they could be over-referring for some cases. They could be over-prescribing certain drugs if they think that's the way to keep the regulator away. And an argument that I hear sometimes against using machine learning in inspections is that it will lead to more inspections and more disruption. Actually, if it's done in an appropriate way, the reverse is actually true. If you've got an effective targeting algorithm, you can actually achieve the same inspection result, identifying the same number of underperformers with fewer inspections than are currently done. But the trade-off is that then you're not inspecting everywhere at the same regular intervals, and some locations will be inspected more than others, and naturally that can lead to a perception of unfairness. So that's all I'm going to say about inspections for the moment. The second topic I want to talk about is when data can signal when we might be in need of help. So we did a project last year working with GambleAware, which is a UK gambling industry body, using data from a large study to try and identify whether we can predict if somebody is in need of help or if they're exhibiting a gambling problem based on the transactions that they are doing on a gambling site. So that's when they're depositing money into their gambling accounts, the kind and the nature of bets they're making, the odds, whether they're winning, what time of day it is, all that sort of thing. and then when they're withdrawing money, and then just mixing that together with some basic demographic information that we know about the users. So this is part of a research study that users opted into, and then we administered a survey, a problem gambling severity index survey, which is a clinically validated survey for the severity of an individual's gambling problem, if they have one at all. And it turns out that, yes, using those 3 sources of data, you can identify with quite a high accuracy whether someone has a gambling problem. And indeed, we also know that if you're able to match that with some sort of contextual personality data, such as you might be able to determine from someone's Facebook usage, then the accuracy of that increases even more. That's one example. Another example that we've now replicated with a few local authorities is around children's social care. So for the benefit of those of you who maybe don't know very much about children's social care, when a referral is made to children's services because someone has a concern about a particular family, what generally happens is there's a 45-day window in which a social worker has to compile case notes and gather evidence. And at that 45-day point, they have to decide, does this case meet a certain legal threshold above which they have to take some statutory action, which could include child protection proceedings, or in more severe cases, a looked-after child, where the child is looked after by someone other than their parents, or whether it doesn't meet that threshold. And if it doesn't meet that threshold, then the social worker can either do nothing, or they can offer what's called early help, which is anything which doesn't have a sort of formal legal basis behind it, so something like mediation or counselling or offering somebody a place on an addiction therapy course, for example. Those would all be examples of early help. And it turns out that just by analysing the language that social workers use in their case notes, which are typically thousands of words long, so they actually contain quite a rich amount of data, we can predict which cases are likely to escalate if nothing is done at the present moment. And so that can be a very valuable resource to use to target those precious early help places, which have a cost associated with them. The social workers can't give them out to everyone. But this can help them target those early help resources towards those cases which are most in need of it. Now, both of these examples are motivated by wanting to help the people who need it the most, but not everyone is necessarily going to see it this way, and in particular, people who need help will not always make rational decisions. They will not always consent to things which are in their own interest. If you're on a huge gambling spree and you've just lost £5,000, say, and actually you're in the middle of having a bit of a gambling-related crisis, then it's not going to be terribly productive to put a message in front of you saying, would you like to stop gambling now? Even though that may well be in the individual's best interest, the time to do that was before we got into this state in the first place. So if we can predict based on someone's deposit history, for example, the fact that you've made 3 deposits today, rather than the more normal 1, and that you seem to have quite erratic betting patterns today, then that third time you put the third £1,000 or whatever it is into your gambling account, that's the time to say, you've been gambling quite a lot now. Do you want to maybe have 10 minutes more and then we'll call it a day? I mean, obviously there's no perfect solution here, and actually the data science work we did here informed a number of interventions that we then trialled on various online gambling platforms. And for this reason, that you can't rely on a sort of, an individual in quite a hot emotional state to make a rational decision, data is usually used under legal bases other than consent. To return to the social worker example, the relationship between social services and a family that's being investigated is typically quite adversarial, because families are naturally very cognizant of the risk that they may forcibly have the amount of contact with their children reduced, which is naturally very stressful. So data is processed because there is an interest in protecting the child, and that's the legal basis for doing that. But naturally, that will lead to lots of objections, and that's why machine learning is not routinely used in this way, at least in the UK. And even if you were to try and seek informed consent, we know, as Claudia mentioned right at the start, that very few people actually read the terms and conditions you put in front of them. So while it may be theoretical consent, in practice, it's not very informed. Excuse me. So that's the kind of public sector angle. One thing that's also quite interesting to me is the business-to-business angle. And I think partly because businesses are quite afraid of being maybe sued or accused of defamation or libel if they publish their own opinions of business-to-business suppliers. what that gets in the way of is that it doesn't, if you think back to the restaurant example, you have many restaurants to choose from, but you have this whole host of reviews to help you choose one that other people think is a good restaurant. In a business-to-business environment, you don't have that. You're faced with the choice of 25 IT suppliers. They all have glossy-looking websites, but you don't have much of an idea of what other businesses actually think. And so that's getting in the way of an efficient business-to-business market and businesses making effective decisions. So that's all I kind of got to say. I'll leave you with a quote from Isaac Asimov. If you think this is all far too intrusive, then, I won't spoil the plot from this particular short story, but suffice to say, it was one in which a technology was discovered which made the world a lot more transparent than the world we actually live in. So happy Goldfish Bowl to you, to me, and to everyone, and may you all fry in hell forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I ask all three of you to come and join me up here? And we have loads of questions that have come in already, and we also have some questions that I want to ask you as well. Mike, there were a couple of things I wanted to ask you. I thought it was really interesting about the restaurants. When it says health score, do you think the public know what that means? Do we know? Because I'm at first, when I saw it, I'd have thought it meant whether it was healthy or not. Is this fast food or something, a salad?
So if you hover over it, it kind of gives you a description of what it is. So I think kind of it's like it doesn't all come through when you just look at a screenshot of it. But it's something that we had thought about, like kind of what the right way to phrase that is. I would say that kind of in general, in disclosure context, it's pretty tricky to make sure that everybody's like fully understanding what you're trying to get across to them. So, and it's not just kind of like the wording like that. A second example of things that could go wrong is the example I had shown with the Alexander Steakhouse had a score of 85. And I remember one of the times I presented this, someone said, "Oh, I like that restaurant. Good thing it has a good score." But actually, 85 is pretty low in the context of San Francisco scores. So even just thinking kind of as a policymaker designing this, like what's the right way to design the distribution to kind of make sure you're getting the right signal across? Optimally, you would want people to kind of guess back 85 means these types of violations.
And did you get any, maybe there wasn't a way for them to do it, but was there any feedback at all from restaurants on what they thought of this? Because, obviously it's not good if they have a rat in their kitchen, but they must really hate it when they've got a low score up like that.
So I think in general, like in the disclosure context, like it's not uncommon for business associations to oppose disclosure and transparency initiatives. So if we even think back to like car initiatives in the US to put miles per gallon on like the window, car makers weren't really excited about the idea of having this as like an extra feature to think about. And I think kind of in practice, some of the dialogue in this context and others has kind of involved getting stakeholders from like restaurant association, the inspectors, customers kind of on board to figure out like what are the things you could change, what are things that you should be disclosing, should you be inspecting more often. So I know in at least one city, like the discussion involved, okay, well maybe this is an opportunity to make sure that even though kind of inspections are running behind, that this will sort of like help be a vehicle not just to help get customers information, but also to get the inspectors to make sure that they're doing like the inspections as often as they're supposed to be doing it, and then helping to kind of fix the problems as they go along.
And you were talking about what outcomes might be ideal to measure and what outcomes you can measure. Were you able to see that it was more effective doing this than, say, just, fining restaurants more? And were you able to see any difference on public health? Or is it? So
like finding them more if they were to get the...
Yeah, finding them instead. Not using this system, but just, using a normal system of fines and shutting them down.
So it's a great question. I think kind of one of the things that people have found historically appealing about disclosure policy, and part of the reason that people have thought about this as policy to begin with, is because some of the challenges of implementing fines and other kind of heavier-handed regulation. The thought has been often that, if you could get it right and make sure that you're getting kind of messages right, like kind of step back to, econ and as early as the 1960s, people talking about you need information for a market to function. So the thought has been if you get enough information, this is an easier tool to implement than trying to put kind of heavy-handed fines or other types of initiatives. But I don't have great evidence on kind of which would be more effective in this context.
Yeah. And Chanuki, I thought it was so interesting looking at the different views and what people think about the different views. Were you able to take into account at all that, of course, although a lot of people might like one view, there are individual differences as well, aren't there? So like some people will love the sea and some people will love mountains. And are you able to take that into account at all?
Unfortunately not, because the trick about this data that I'm getting from Scenic or not is that it's anonymous. So to be able to collect data on a very large scale, you have to make it as easy as possible. So we don't ask any questions. I mean, I didn't design the website itself. It was designed by my society in the first place. But what they wanted to do was encourage as many people to submit data as possible. The trade-off is that I don't know the individual characteristics, therefore I never had that to basically test that. But it would be interesting, I think, to test, especially how different cultures react to different scenes. So a lot of this is, I mean, I don't actually know where people have come from, but I can imagine that it might be like a European-centric view, and be very interesting from different cultures how people might perceive beauty, because sometimes people are a bit scared of natural places as well. So, it's not always like that nature is this kind of relaxing space.
Yeah, the countryside is really quiet at night. If you're growing up in a city, it's really quiet.
Yeah, it could be a bit eerie. So it would really be interesting to do, but unfortunately I didn't have the data.
Yeah, and it's interesting, there's this whole idea of whether people have evolved to like certain landscapes, because isn't there an issue with the theories that suggest that what we've all evolved to like is being on the savannah? Well, that wasn't necessarily a safe, relaxing place. It wasn't like a walk in the countryside in those days. Presumably you were trying not to get eaten by lions, and lions could hide. You can hide in places, but lions can hide there too.
Yeah. So, I mean, so like I said, it's just a theory, and it's interesting to see when I'm testing it. So I do find some natural features as being associated with things we like, but there are also built-up features as well. I think the one thing that was interesting is that the fact that if you can view out into horizon, people, so if you can't see too far, like the no horizon, then people are reading down it. And that was one thing that kind of echoed with the safety thing. But it's hard to say, is it evolutionary driven, is it culturally driven? Again, that's a very hard thing to answer. But it was interesting that there were actually statistical signals. So there does seem to be a collective preference, but I'm not exactly sure what's actually driving that preference, per se.
Yeah. And James, I think it's really interesting, the idea of using the algorithms for inspections. Is there a risk that to save money, people might then say, well, let's just rely on the algorithm and not bother with the inspections, or have far, far fewer inspections and miss things?
Yes, I mean, that is a risk to an extent. In practice, from the conversations I've had with regulators, I think the preference is to kind of move towards a direction where you use it to some extent. And there's also a question of how you evaluate it as well. Once you start to use an algorithm to target inspections, it actually becomes very hard to measure how well that algorithm is doing, because if there are cases that you're missing that you should be detecting, and the algorithm's not telling you, then you're not inspecting, you don't have the data in front of you. So I think a really important thing is to couple a sort of an algorithm-based approach with reacting to specific reports. And that's still an important job of a regulator, where somebody sort of phones you up and complains or sends you an email or whatever. Then you actually respond to that with a series of targeted inspections where you're actually using your own knowledge and reports that you're getting in, as well as feeding those to the algorithm. But yes, very good point.
And I was thinking with the social workers, I think that's interesting that you can that the algorithm can spot which cases might escalate later. Is that something that social workers themselves, with all their experience, could also spot? Like if they had a system where they were allowed to put an asterisk by, this is one you really need to watch, you might get the same thing through experience.
So yeah, I'm glad you asked that actually. So yes and no. So one really interesting finding we found when we did this analysis is that some of the linguistic features in the case notes that predict a case is likely to escalate is around the use of sort of justifying language on the part of the social worker. So language along the lines of, I must conclude this case does not meet the requirements of section so-and-so of law so-and-so, so I must recommend no further action at this time. So when they lay that out very clearly, we find that those cases are quite likely to escalate. But that's not the whole story. There are also lots of other linguistic features and also topics relating to actually the circumstances of the family, which are more reassuring findings in some way that, we know that some certain circumstances are more likely to escalate than others.
And somebody's asked here, what is the sort of specific language that would predict escalation?
Yes, so that example I just gave is one of them. So we use, it's what's known in the business as a topic model. So it's looking at how long a social worker spends talking about a particular topic. So examples of topics might be sort of protective, more distant family members, such as aunts or uncles, for example. That's one which might predict is less likely to escalate. Or particular circumstances such as alcoholism or gambling problems, drug addictions, those sorts of things. So those are the kind of predictors we're looking at using, as well as sort of specific individual words.
Now, there's all sorts of interesting questions for everybody here. Chanuki, here's an interesting one. Why should beauty be restricted to the outdoors? What about the beauty of architecture around where you live, or even within your home, say design, furnishings, art? Would there be a way of using data to look at some of those things and to look at architecture? It's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love to, if I had data on it. That's always the thing. There's so many questions I'd love to answer if I don't have the data. But it is possible, actually. I have thought about this. So basically, so like a website called Zoopla. I mean, you can possibly look at the price of a place and perhaps use it as a proxy for beauty because it's demand. You would pay more. But it's basically because I don't have beauty ratings on interior pictures. So that's the only thing that's actually stopping me from doing that. I mean, I could do that proxy with prices. There was another part of that question.
Well, you could could you look at architecture outside? You could look at that maybe.
Yeah, so another thing we're actually trying to do at the moment at the Alan Turing Institute with another collaborator, Stephen Law, is to try to understand the architectural design attributes. So I would never look at architectural styles because I think that would be too banal, but I'd love to give more feedback to policymakers. So right now, the feedback I can give is quite limited, and I would like to do a little bit more with design attributes. So one of the things we did was we made a neural network that can look at an image and tell you whether it's a blank frontage or an active frontage. So blank frontage is when you're walking down the street and it's like these really tall walls and you just can't engage with the frontage. And an active frontage is a scene where there's windows and you can kind of engage with that frontage. And we find that is actually associated with beauty. So we're doing a little bit more work to try to come up with more concrete architectural attributes to kind of inform policymakers.
Now, there's a good question here that there's a couple of questions about, which is something for all of you really, which is, since all these things rely on finding data sets, do you have any good tips on where to find these possibly unusual data sets that you can then use to analyse? James?
Yes, good question, and such a broad question as well. I mean, most of the examples I presented around regulation, actually all of that data is public. So the prescription data is public, for example, and for any Australians in the audience, actually there's incredibly detailed prescriptions data in Australia, right down to the individual GP level. You can see how many packets of this drug that this GP is prescribing in this month. It's incredible data. I wish I got a chance to work with it. And it was actually used as part of a big behavioural trial to try and decrease the number of unnecessary antibiotic prescriptions. But besides the great stuff that's in the public domain, just looking out for great research studies such as the Gamble-Aware study that we mentioned, and some of your examples as well. And sometimes just going out to public services and sort of forming relationships with them and sort of identifying ways in which they can use the data that they already collect. So the social worker case notes, for example, they're already writing the case notes. We're not making them collect any data that they weren't collecting already. It's just using that in a new way.
But isn't it hard getting access to that?
Yes,
sort of
I mean,
thing?
so you have to go through quite an involved data protection and everything else procedure to allow access and anonymisation and everything else. And yes, sometimes you have to stick at it for quite a long period, but it's worth it in the end.
And Chanuki, what would you say about how to find these data sets and the sorts of things you were looking at?
It's quite hard, actually. I mean, there's some really good resources, like for the UK Data Archive, it's fantastic. But to be honest, a lot of it's just also asking people and talking to people and trying to find collaborators. Some of the data, because of privacy issues, are not just publicly available, and you have to kind of justify why you actually want to use it. So it's actually possibly also just going out and trying to make really good collaborations with people that might be working on something that's interesting to you.
And Mike, have you been using more? Obviously, the reviews are just there. Anybody can see those, but do you use other data sets too?
Yeah, so we use other data. So the outcome metrics are kind of things that were internal Yelp data. In general, kind of when we start a project like this, we'll start by thinking about what's the policy or managerial problem we're trying to address. Then we'll try to kind of bucket this into, is this a causal inference question? So should we be thinking about trying to either run an experiment or get some natural experiment to figure out what's driving what? Or is this more of a prediction problem? So are we just trying to get a sense of like where there are going to be the most violations or where housing prices are going to go up? So we try to bucket it into those two worlds. Then once we kind of decide which of those worlds are in, we'll kind of do this, like we kind of call this a data audit, right? So we'll just kind of say, what's the internal data that we have access to, like kind of sitting within the organization. So, maybe it's notes from somebody, maybe it's kind of housing prices that you have access to in an internal thing, maybe it's kind of data that you have sitting there on who's kind of like requested directions. Then we'll think like, what are the dream external data sets you'd want to have? So like if you're thinking about restaurant outcomes, we'll think in terms of like maybe it's the tax records or sales for something. So kind of, and not think about feasibility or other issues in this first stage, and think about like kind of how do you lay out that landscape, and then we'll be very explicit about what all of those are. When there's a gap between the data that we want and the data that we have, we'll try to kind of create a map between the data that we have. So whether it's like clicks on a website or something like pictures of a building, and then try to say like, what's the thing we're moving toward, and see like how good is that map, and how good is it both when you're trying to predict something, and how good is it when you're kind of measuring changes in that? Are you kind of falling into a clickbait world? So a lot of the reason like parts of internet have broken is because you kind of go to Google, you go to Facebook, and they've been optimizing to clicks because that's the cheapest, easiest thing to track. But nobody really cares about clicks. They care about something else. And I think over time, a bunch of companies and policymakers have tried to be more thoughtful about like, don't just take the data that's easiest for you to get. Try to be a little bit more thoughtful about what the map is. Then kind of in terms of how do you go about getting it, then we'll think about what's the marginal gain of each of these additional data sets, and what are kind of some of the problems that might have. So maybe it's kind of like privacy invasion, so you don't want to go after it. Maybe it's costly, so you don't want to go after it. Maybe the data you have is already kind of gets you 90% of the way there, so it's just not worth kind of trying to figure out, are there data partnerships to get a bunch of other stuff that you might bring in.
And there's a couple of questions about using review data in particular. One is if it becomes clear to the public that review data can affect intervention from regulators, isn't there a risk that people will start gaming the system, since anyone can write these reviews? How do you stop that?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting problem in kind of algorithms more broadly, right? So like as soon as you put an algorithm in place to sort of like start targeting any behavior, like once people know what that is, and especially kind of like the more transparent the algorithm is, the easier it becomes to game it. In the context of reviews, there's actually, so review fraud is very broadly like kind of a very big problem that these, like every major platform, like kind of the Amazons, eBays, Yelp, TripAdvisor, they all kind of have these teams that sort of try to figure out like how do you kind of actually using algorithms to figure out who are the fake reviewers and who's trying to game the system. And then they all treat those differently and set different thresholds for kind of how much you want to turn those off, throw them out, leave them on, and just know that there are going to be some low quality reviews on there, and there's a lot of managerial judgment in that. Now, in terms of kind of having algorithms to do other things, kind of like one question is, how do you, like, kind of, can you avoid gaming? And the ways that people might think about it is like, in practice, some people just kind of run experiments to see if there is gaming. But one thing I would say is that, like, for example, if you're trying to write reviews or write case notes in the effort to kind of game something, there are much easier ways that already exist to game. So you could just call 311 in the US and they'll send an inspector to a restaurant right away. So in a lot of these contexts, yes, I think kind of the Occam's razor of gaming would be to do the simpler thing. So I think it's kind of a case-by-case basis where it's like in the very simple, like think about, is this gaming that's already happening, and is this really going to funnel in here? And if this is funneling in here, can you do something like you do for review fraud and try to have a team, or fake news, right? And try to have a team that says like, what are the ways to identify that? And once you go down that road, people typically kind of do some combination of, so some of it is like human curation. So like if you think about like how Facebook has thought about like their kind of fake news problem. It's been trying to think about, are there sets of partners that will read through some sets of articles, use that to get a more scalable algorithm to figure out like what's the fake news that's coming through, and then set a threshold for kind of tolerance, and kind of when something comes through, figure out what do you do with it? Do you kind of funnel it off to do further review, or do you just kind of let it go, or do you just delete it altogether?
And I'd be interested to ask you two actually, but all of this refers to the reviews. Somebody's asked, is it ethical, since it does, this does involve businesses and their turnover? Is it fair to do this kind of thing when it could affect their business? What would you say, James?
So at the end of the day, say, are you sort of talking examples such as Mike's, where you're with the food hygiene?
Yeah.
Then an inspection result is a public piece of data that people have a right to know. An inspection result is always a public result, at least in the industries that we've talked about. And if people have a right to know it, then there's the same argument that most journalists would use, for example, in terms of putting information that I would argue is in the public interest, putting that in front of people. So I would argue that it is. Obviously, it's a contentious subject.
Chanuki, what would you say? What limits should there be on how data is used like this?
I mean, as long as you can kind of prove the benefit to individuals and consumers in this instance, then I think it's fine. I think it's just sometimes it becomes a bit difficult to tell, and that's when it's a bit tricky. But I guess in this instance, it's quite clear.
Yeah, and somebody's asked, Mike, did you only focus on warning against poor performance for health, or did you also look at how to attract good performance? How to the people trying to get a high score.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's something that we had thought about, and there was kind of so in that particular decision, there was a team of people within Yelp that were also kind of interested in when were they willing to and open to kind of disclosing information back to people. And then there was a discussion of if people trying to figure out when would people want to know. So our motivation basically came from the first round suggestive results that seemed like people were most reactive at the bottom, which led us to think about, okay, maybe that's where it's most useful for customers, so where it would be most useful to kind of surface the information. Thought a little bit about it. In the case of health inspections, part of the discussion revolved around whether people would really kind of say, well, this restaurant's particularly clean, so I'm going to go there. Whereas we thought it was more likely that people would be kind of turned off by a restaurant that's particularly dirty. But I can imagine other settings where you would want to do it the exact opposite of what we had done.
And let me ask all of you, what's the data you'd most like to get hold of, Chanuki? What would you like to be able to get?
I would love to get hold of the data Google has. There's a lot of the companies. So at the moment, I'm worried about the fact that a lot of the data that can actually help us is actually held by large corporations. And I know that companies are willing to share the data, but it's so difficult to actually get the right connection to try to get to the data. And I wish they would make it easier, because we could do things that actually can help people, and they shouldn't make it that difficult. So.
James, what would you say?
So this kind of ties in with the last point I made around understanding business behaviour. So this is actually starting to happen in the UK now, but sort of joining together the various different data sets you need to, so for example from HMRC on tax, from Bayes on exporting, and similar other business-based data sets to understand sort of both small but wider business decision making, and how both as regulators and as government and wider than that, we can actually help them make effective decisions that are informed by both other people, but also giving them the chance to kind of do their own thing if they want to.
What data would you really like to get, Mike?
So it's a good question. I don't know that there's kind of one dream data set that I'm hoping to get. There are some data sets that I think we should work harder not to kind of get out there. Some that I think we should have more transparent. One thing that I've been thinking about is whether there could be more concerted efforts among companies and policymakers to kind of really think through what the sets of problems their data is useful for, and whether there's a way that's kind of like not violating people's rights to, so kind of not invasive to privacy, not kind of risking their strategic business decisions, but where TripAdvisor could just turn over a panel of city, month data on businesses, or where kind of like tax records could be kind of aggregated to a level, but like in a targeted way that would allow researchers and policymakers to then feed that in at a much broader scale. Because I think kind of these problems that have been mentioned are very real problems, which is that I think probably everybody in this room who's tried to go get a data set has kind of run into this wall where you kind of say, oh, here's the data I'd like, and then even at best, you kind of have this extended negotiation, and then there are questions around, which of these are sensitive. And I think that in a lot of the cases, businesses could kind of have this discussion once, like kind of whether you're a bank or whether you're a review company, and think very carefully about the ethical, business, managerial kind of just like kind of considerations around this, and then say, okay, here's our public-facing data set, and let's just make this available to everybody to use.
And here's an interesting question. How can we get behavioural scientists to partner more with data scientists? What's getting in the way of this happening? Do you work with data scientists, or would you call yourself data scientists as well, because you are doing that?
Well, I am a data
You are.
scientist.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the problem is that we speak different languages. So I actually study behavioral economics, so for me, it isn't that difficult to work with behavioral economics.
You can be the linchpin
yeah, I'm
between
kind of like
them
the
all.
in-between person. But
Yeah.
but actually, in the beginning, when I was actually trying to collaborate with computer scientists, I realized we spoke different languages. I think that's a problem. So we talk about exactly the same thing, but we use different words, and then we think we don't understand each other. And that's kind of the problem, is that the fields kind of develop differently. And if we could just find a way to kind of talk to each other, I think, so for example, data scientists should learn a little bit more about behavioral economics, and behavioral economics should learn a little bit more about like machine learning, for example. And then you could see that actually a lot of the things we're talking about are exactly the same thing.
Yeah. Do you think it is the same thing that you're talking about often?
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think the key to a lot of this is to just do it. Yeah, I'm very lucky to have worked with the Behavioural Insights team for nearly 3 years now, and everything I learned about behavioural science I learned at BIT. I am very much a dyed-in-the-wool data scientist and statistician, but I think what's kind of, from my experience within BIT, what's kind of made the behavioural scientists there alive to the fact that data science can work for them is just having a few project examples where you've gone in, and maybe it's an example where they're sort of drowning in a sea of potential intervention. So I'll take one example. We worked with East Sussex on road safety. They had hired us to sort of identify why their traffic collisions were more severe than normal. They weren't having too many collisions, but the collisions they were having, there were more fatalities and serious injuries than they would expect. And road safety is such a big issue that the kind of behavioural scientists were saying, like, do I target this group, that group? What do I do? When do I target them? And actually being able to use data science, because there's lots of good data on collisions in the UK, to zero in on, here are the 3 groups which are unusually risky in East Sussex. Here's what they're doing, because the collisions data actually tells you what the causes of the crashes were. Then actually being able to use that so then the behavioural scientists could do their best work in targeting the right people with the right things. That's what I think sold the rest of BIT, and what I'm trying to
What was
preach
the
more
answer?
widely.
Do you know what the answer was? What were the
In East
accidents
Sussex,
and why? Yeah.
So in East Sussex it was young people, so they're a high-risk group nationally, but particularly in East Sussex. It was motorcyclists, so the key statistics there was that if you do a mile on a motorbike, that is 12 times as risky than a mile in a car, nationally. In East Sussex, that figure is 26 times. So a mile on a motorbike in East Sussex, 26 times more risky. So, 20-mile motorbike journey, that's the same as going all the way up to Scotland.
Wow.
And the third group, which is perhaps slightly more worrying to maybe some people in this room, is 40 to 60-year-old car drivers interacting with vulnerable road users, usually within 3 miles of home, usually careless or reckless or in a hurry. And they're causing collisions with vulnerable road users, so cyclists, pedestrians, old people.
There's a nice message to end on. Drive carefully near your houses and everywhere
Especially
else.
in Sussex.
Obviously, especially in Sussex, yeah. Well, don't go there, yeah. Well, thank you very much to all of you. I think that was absolutely fascinating. Now, the final session of the day takes place in the Fleming room, just here, next door. So we'll see you all there very soon. There's a short break before then. But meanwhile, thank you very much to Mike, Chanuki and James. Thank you.